All right, let's do a run through of Europe. This PowerPoint is again on Google Sites. All of the stuff before this slide is a complete review of where we left off in Unit 0. So I can cruise through it real quick, but I'm not going to spend any time on it because, again, you hypothetically already have all this in your notes. So we had talked about the breakup of Europe into the West and the East when the Roman Empire crumbled, and how the West part of it ended up breaking apart due to multiple factors. And then you had the Eastern side being the Byzantine Empire, and it was still thriving and doing fine for quite some time. We had talked about serfdom being a thing, urbanization declining because we broke up into little kingdoms and kind of, I guess we could say went back in time of how civilizations worked for a while in the quote dark ages, with roads falling into disrepair, them kind of like dropping out of major trade networks. Please know the difference between a decentralized and a centralized government, because that comes into play huge in this unit. We talked about there not being an emperor anymore. It was just all these little kingdoms with kings. And in reality, you had a king, but it was often the noble families that yielded or wielded more power in their regions. So we talk about it. Europe is just far removed from all these major trading networks that exist. Yeah, they still have access to some, but when their roads fall into disrepair, they really have to use the water routes. And a lot of it will be through either Dar al-Islam's existence in Spain or the Byzantine Empire in the East. So they're a bunch of weak little states, subsistence farming. They just make enough to usually get by. Invasions keep wrecking them. We didn't talk about this guy much, but Charlemagne, Charles the Great in France, he is kind of seen as one iconic monarch of the time who does well for his people. I mean, he's one that sticks out. Are there plenty of other kings and stuff that existed throughout these time periods, these hundreds of years? Absolutely. But Charlemagne is seen as like Charlemagne the Great. Filial piety is a thing, right? I think I have one in here. Filial piety is not filial piety, sorry. Fiefs and vassals, feudalism. Again, brain's not working so well today, I apologize. The feudal system with vassals and fiefs that they give to people, and this system of we give you this and in return you do this for us, right? And like while the nobles were kind of running the ship there and you had the king at the head of society, the unifying factor for all of Europe was the church, and the church gained a lot of power throughout this period. And there was always squabbling between monarchs and religious officials like the Pope, because again, there was all of this, I don't know, this power vacuum that was left when Rome fell. So Christianity spreads throughout the old Roman Empire for quite some time until we have Islam kind of break up the stuff in Northern Africa. The church organizes itself. We've seen this graphic before, organizes itself kind of to match hierarchy systems of the world they live in. We talked about excommunication and what it means to like interdict an entire state or city or village. We talked about ugly medieval babies. We talked about why did it stop? Well, it's because the invasions finally ended and it made things more secure and stable. Things got warmer, the little ice age went away, and they could grow more stuff, which led to population increasing, which led to cities popping back up, and then eventually getting back looped into trade systems. Now it gave new opportunities for women. We didn't really talk about monastic life that much, but monastic life is going to be monks and stuff and priests living in these little parcels of land where they usually farm, but then they spend a lot of their day like praying and transcribing texts like Bibles and other religious verses. And their whole day is just spent like praying and being that level of, Christian. Sometimes they're going out to the towns. But this becomes one of your options, I suppose, in life, if you want to go off to be a monk. We also have blending of cultures. We do have some of these religious people have access to like philosophy, and they kind of start working that in. So people like Thomas Aquinas, he is a philosopher who's also a Christian. So he's a scholar and a religious person. And so it makes this interesting overlap, and that will later blossom into something else we'll talk about. but people are trying to look at how do you mix philosophy and academics with the religious world, or are they two separate things that can exist together? And people like Thomas Aquinas said, actually, they can. All right, we had mentioned serfdom and feudalism, and we had talked about the idea that, again, I'm skipping all of this because we've done it all. These slides are the exact same ones. So we talked about serfdom being kind of the new type of slavery, right? These people are tied to the land and they work hard to get just enough food to get by, and then they give a large portion of it to the person that's owning them, their vassal, and in return, like that vassal says, "Oh, I'll protect you if anything ever happens." But again, it's basically a coercive type of labor. So we had seen this structure, and then we looked at Japan and said, "Hey, guess what? Japan actually is having like the same type thing happen with, the daimyo and the shogun and the samurai and stuff like that." Okay. We also have conversion happening, which becomes a larger story in Unit 4. But people want to, convert as many Christians. Women also find a place in the church. So these convents that exist, women are still considered property of the men in their lives. So I guess convents offered a sense of independence for women. You had the option to get married and do that, or you could run off and become a nun and give your life to God. And then, you didn't have to marry whoever your parents deemed you had to go marry and be owned by a man. Instead, you'd go and live in a convent with other women praying. And there would be like a clergyman that would show up and be kind of in charge, but you had a head nun. So basically, it was mostly a female dominant place where, I guess it was a choice you could make. It doesn't maybe sound like a nice choice to some of us in here, but it was a choice, and that was hopeful to many women. Okay, we have guilds show up, these craft guilds, for instance, where people have a specific trade or skill that they participate in. And there would be guilds that kind of represent people who are millers or coppers or down the line, like silversmiths and masons and stuff. So there'd just be people, there'd be like, I don't know, they're your professional communities, right? People who do this job are all professional at it. So then they all work together and do it and like watch out for each other, I suppose. So the craft guilds inserted that their craft and trade effectively became a closed shop or monopoly, preventing any outside competition. If you are part of the blacksmith guild or the textile guild, whatever specific one it may be, you would all band together and then you'd control the prices, and you wouldn't have anyone threatening to put anyone out of business because you all were. And it was kind of like a union, kind of like went together and protected each other and set prices so no one could be kicked out or put out of business. We talked about the plows, through field system, old news. Talked about the Crusades and how they weren't super effective. But it was this idea of if you go and fight for the Crusades, then you get a free pass from all your sins. So I did pause on this slide because this word indulgence, we're going to talk about it more when we get to like King Henry. I think he's also Unit 4, maybe Unit 3. And it's this idea that indulgences are things that you can like pay the church for. If you say like, hey, I've done a lot of things, I'm worried I'm going to go to purgatory or hell. You go to the church and you pay for these tickets or whatever that basically say like, oh, they paid this much to the church, which is a positive thing they've done for the faith. So here it like reduces your sentence or whatever, removes penalties from your sins. And going on the Crusades would give you an opportunity for an indulgence. So you could get a pass on a lot of the things that you did. So we can look at the effects of the Crusades, but again, like John Green said, he's like, not much. Not a ton of things happen because of it. There's really no long-lasting conversion. They don't hold on to Jerusalem for very long. So pretty much nothing. Now we're jumping to the new stuff, the European Renaissance that occurs. So if we look at right before the Renaissance, the Little Ice Age occurs, and then it goes away and people can start growing more food. So the Little Ice Age is a period of global cooling between the 14th and 19th centuries. And its height, it was just so cold that they couldn't really get great results on crops, which led to, not as much food being able to be grown, which kept the population pretty stagnant. winters were really cold. The summers were too rainy to have any good crops. So it wasn't mass starvation because it was so cold, everything was covered in ice. Just things are a little cooler and wetter where it's really tough to sustain large populations. Another thing that goes through this region that we didn't talk about was the bubonic plague, so the Black Death. The Black Death kills millions of people. In some places, it's estimated that it killed 80% of people living right next to the Mediterranean Sea. It wiped out just so many people, and trade is to blame. When we talk about the Mongols, we're going to talk about how, we know that the plague, the Black Death, the bubonic plague started in Asia, and then the Mongols, they were just such a rapid spreading force in their conquering escapades that they brought that with them. And then also on ships, rats would stow on there in these major port cities where these ships would end up. The rats would get off and bring the plague with those fleas on them, and it would just devastate these cities. It created really weak governments, whether it was killing off the governments or just, it's mass chaos. The good thing it did was, if you are somebody who is of the peasant class, if you didn't do your job well, they could just like, we'll fire you because there's another peasant that is looking for a job right behind you. So if you don't do what we want and deal with the fact that we're going to pay you next to nothing, too bad, just you're out of here. But when a large portion of the population is killed off, people are like, oh my God, 50% of my workers died. I don't have enough to get by. Workers start saying, that are alive and didn't get killed by the plague are like, well, we'd love a job, but I'm not really interested if you don't pay me this wage. And now all of a sudden the people that are in charge paying these peasants, they're like, hey, well, I can pay you, $1 a day. And they're like, that's not good enough. So-and-so down the road said they're going to start paying peasants $1.50 a day. And now they have this ability to kind of like engage in capitalism before it exists, to say, I know there's not a lot of us. If you want me to work for you, I need a pay raise and I need you to treat me better. And it gives them like power as peasants to start pushing for better working conditions or better pay. So it's a super interesting thing. And when we look at why did feudalism go away, one of the reasons is the Black Death. It gives people on the bottom of that social pyramid more power than they've ever had for, asking for better treatment. And then you also have land redistribution because so many people die. There's all this land that, their owners are dead. So you recalibrate because there's less people in the world. And that's kind of a positive. Religiously, it kind of went one of two ways. People either got really into religion and prayed really hard to get it to stop, thinking it would protect them, or at least it would lead to them, going to heaven. And then you had other people that were like, well, everyone's dying anyway, we should just party. So you had this whole group of people that were like, everyone's dead, my whole family's gone, I'm going to have a good time because I know I'm next. So who cares how many bad choices I make, and who cares about practicing my faith? So it was really interesting, this split that existed. Other people just got kind of cynical towards religion because they're like, I've prayed, I've done all this, so did my family, but these people still died. So, maybe God's not listening to us. So that was another angle. You also had people go and start, what is the cause of it? They didn't understand that it was the bacteria in the belly of a flea, and the flea killing off its host and just moving on to the next one. They didn't understand that science of it. So of course they're like, well, who is doing this? Who's to blame? And often, like Jews were often blamed for this, saying like, we have a Jew in town, and I saw them over by the well. I think they poisoned the well with this, and that's what killed everyone in our town. Witchcraft accusations go through the roof as well. So again, you have a lot of scapegoating and a lot of like persecution of minorities due to this. Now, I'll post this video as well. I love learning about the Black Death. I find it just like, it's grotesque, it's horrific, but it's also super interesting. Now, another group that is just crazy that pops up are the Flagellates. It's not flatulence. Flatulence are farts. Flagellants are these people with these hoods on, those pointy hoods. They're religious individuals who decide that if they act out the suffering of their Jesus Christ figure, that through the pain that they bring on, the spilling of their own blood, it will, I guess, like almost like appease God, because they're pretending to be like Jesus when he was getting crucified. So therefore, it'll save everyone from the plague. Like they're going to just pay for the sins of everyone. So these guys would go around, and I listened to a crazy podcast about it. And it was talking about how, like, I always assume like these pictures, there's what, like 10 of these guys. So I was like, oh, wow, like 10 people doing this stuff. What they do is they'd have these like cat of nine tails, these whips, and they would just whip themselves on their backs while they walked. And they were just like bleeding everywhere and in pain. But then they'd get like, just like caught up in the moment and the craziness of it all. So then they just like whip harder and like go through the pain. Like it was very violent. No, sometimes it turns out like there would be groups of like 100 to 200 flagellants that would come into town. And it was like, think of it like a rock band shows up. Like, these people are coming. You've heard about them far and wide, and they're coming to a town near you. So everyone in the middle of a plague, when you're not so probably supposed to be around tons of people, because that's how you spread the Black Death, you go to see the flagellants in the town square. And they are whipping each other. There's blood going everywhere. Some of them have like these barbs on their whips that like dig into their skin. It is crazy and grotesque and intense. And people are there like, yes, they're going to save us. This is the best thing I've ever seen. They're going to save us from the Black Death because, Jesus suffered and then he cleansed everyone's sins and everything was fixed. So that's what these guys are going to do for us. It was even to the point where like people, after they would leave, there'd be puddles of blood on the ground from it. And people would go and like dip rags in it and take it home with them as a souvenir. Well, here's the problem. The flagellants are going far and wide, and they're picking up the plague wherever they go, and they're hanging out with each other, and there's blood going everywhere and just lots of bodily fluids, and it's spreading it. So you go and you watch them. You're already in a crowd of people, and people probably have the Black Death and don't know it yet. So you're around them, but then the flagellants are sick. So you're taking their blood home on your little souvenir handkerchief, and now you have that coming into your home. So all they did was actively like spread the Black Death worse. But man, they were a sight to see apparently, and people would come from far and wide to try to get a peek at them. So interesting group of people. And no, these are not KKK hoods. I know it looks like that. They are not. All right. So Europe is just a standalone kind of oddity. It's different from the rest of the world in some ways and similar in others. So one thing is there's no culturally universal language. Like in China, there's lots of different groups spread out throughout China, but like everyone speaks Chinese. Or in all those Dar al-Islam empires that exist, it doesn't matter for the most part which one you're in. They all speak Arabic. In Europe, no. It depends on what region of Europe you're from. So the idea of like some people speak French or Spanish or German or Italian or Hungarian or Russian, like they all speak different languages depending on where you're from, and even different dialects within the same region. So you just don't have that unifying cultural factor. They also do not have a centralized government. Like, when we talked about the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad. Baghdad is a location for the centralized government where the caliph lives. The Delhi Sultanate had their own. In Europe, it's like all these fractured kingdoms. And like this map really kind of sums up where the kingdoms are and how like just cut apart everything is. And you don't have any major trading cities. Like Constantinople is probably the closest they have in the Byzantine Empire next door. Europe doesn't have any of those iconic cities where all trade flows through there and everyone wants, to go and trade with this kingdom or with this city. But like, you have Kilwa, you have Malacca, you're going to have these regions in China along the Silk Road. Europe just doesn't have that. Similarities you do have, though, are they have monarchies. Like we see it rise in the Ming dynasty, which in China, we know dynasties work that way. We haven't made it to the Safavid or the Ottomans yet, but in their dynasties or in their empires, you have it. And you start having monarchs, like the famous King Henry VIII and the Tudor line with Elizabeth I and stuff. So that happens. You also have the use of suppression of revolts. If peasants are rising up and trying to overthrow you and they're unhappy with conditions, we don't appease them. We don't listen to them. We don't change our ways. You just crush the rebellion. So a common thing between Europe and the rest of the world. And the consolidation of territory, trying to get more under your belts. We have the Reconquista with Spain pushing out the Islamic world. So they're not 100% different, but there are some vastly different cultural aspects to them. Another person you probably need to know is Marco Polo. He is an Italian explorer. And I think he starts out as a merchant. And let me move his picture here because you can't read everything. He is an Italian merchant initially. Then he goes on traveling escapades, and he travels to China, and he forcibly lived in the Yuan dynasty under a guy named Kubla Khan. We're not there yet because we have to talk about the Mongols and how they invade and take over China. And if you see the Yuan dynasty, it means it's the Mongol China. The Kubla Khan is related to Genghis Khan, the more famous Khan. And him and Marco Polo, quote, like, become buddies. And Marco Polo writes a book about his experiences and how awesome China is and how he's friends with this Khan. And what it does is it inspires other people. When people read this book, like if you are in a place where you often don't go farther than like 10 to 20 miles from your home in your entire life, but then you have access to this book about Marco Polo and his travels to China and back, and people get really interested in it and the riches that are able to be found in China, and inspires others. So people like the dreaded Christopher Columbus, he reads Marco Polo's book, and it kind of gives everyone like the travel bug, where they're like, yes, I want to go check this out. I want to be like these guys. So he is iconic for that. So Marco Polo, he's a name that people know, whether you know about him or not. Most kids are like, Marco Polo, like the game. He's a name you still know. But when we get to people like Ibn Battuta, who people don't know from Africa, Ibn Battuta went further than Marco Polo. Or if you look at people like from China, like Zheng He went way further than them. But Marco Polo, as a European in a Western dominated globe, he's the name we remember. Now, when it comes to things that make a really big impact, the Magna Carta is one of those. It's a series of laws that guarantee the basic rights for barons and landowners, and it limits the power of the king. And the king is kind of forced to sign it. King John II isn't a huge fan of it because he's losing some of his power, but it is kind of this like landmark piece of paper that is people fighting for better rights and taking those away from the monarchy. Read the part about in your textbook about it. They give you a little like paragraph or something about the Magna Carta that's really important. So it is this iconic document that exists where a king is forced to basically listen to people who are not royal and come to some kind of, quote, compromise. Now, most people, when they think of Europe, they think of the Renaissance when it comes to old Europe. And the Renaissance is this cultural period of change and achievement and just like art. Most people remember the art, but there's a lot of science and literature that's going on too. And it really pulls people at the time from the Middle Ages in Europe, those like dark ages, if you want to call them that, to the early modern period where Europe's going to start that climb to be a very commanding force on the world stage. So why does this happen? Well, people rediscover the classical works. We've already talked about how in Dar al-Islam with the House of Baghdad, they had rediscovered the works of famous philosophers and translated them. Europe gets access to them. So that kind of sparks it with literature, philosophy, art as well. You have the development of the printing press, which is it is one of the most monumental game changers. Movable type is created in China, but the printing press is created in Europe by Gutenberg. And all of a sudden, instead of having handwritten books that are expensive and take forever to create, you can now rapidly print pamphlets or books or letters, and it shoots it out to the population at a much faster rate. There's more available, which means they're also cheaper. And now more people have access to the written word, which means they can become literate. So literacy cruises up as well, but so do people like starting to have ideas for themselves and wanting to interpret things and becoming a little more critical with their thinking. Cities start popping back up like we talked about after the mini ice age goes away. And so you start having those cities pop back up and they start participating in trade more. And Italy is going to be the place. So this is a picture of Florence. Florence is noted as the birth of the Renaissance we all think of. The Black Death is stabilizing things in an odd way where it's killing a bunch of people and redistributing land, getting rid of feudalism. And eventually we have the fall of Constantinople. That is not until like the end of this unit 1 and 2, but Byzantines are pretty much gone. And it gives an ability for Western Europe to like surge forward. And then you have the birth of something called humanism. Humanism is all about like creating an enlightened citizenry. Instead of relying solely on the only thing you need to know is the Bible and religious stuff, it's this idea that you can look back on pagan texts like Greek and Roman texts and learn something from them and become, an enlightened philosopher to some degree. And the problem was the church felt like those are pagan writings and paganism, like in the Christian faith, people like a Socrates who, or an Aristotle, these philosophers at the time, they would say, well, yeah, well, they were pagan, so they're still going to be in hell. Like in Dante's Inferno, in that book that's written, it talks about his travels into purgatory and hell. And he finds in purgatory, I think it's purgatory, maybe they're in hell. He finds these old school like Greek philosophers who didn't do anything wrong, but they weren't Christian, so they're there. So again, the church does not think highly about these old school Roman and Greek philosophers or scholars because they weren't Christian. But the humanist movement is like, no, they have value. We can learn stuff from them. And as far as what they think is important to learn in life, things like grammar, speaking rhetoric, history, poetry, moral philosophy, that's super important. But in the other course, we have scholasticism, who believe like that they can somehow reconcile ancient texts with Christian beliefs. You have to tie the two worlds together. There's only approved texts you can use that should be read. The rest are kind of like taboo. So it's just these two competing ideologies at the time. But humanism is really going to blossom into later the Enlightenment, which will shape the entire world. Now, some families come to power. We talked about decentralized governments. Yeah, Italy is going to have like a leader, it's going to have a king, but it's also going to have a really, really important rich families. And the Medici family is a banking family in Italy, in Florence, who become super iconic because they have the wealth. They have all these beautiful like mansions and stuff, but they also are going to be a huge supporter of the Renaissance because they use their money to pay artists to create all these iconic works that exist that Europe is famous for today. So rich families come up, and not only do they support the arts and they have money, because they have money, they can engage in politics and really shape the political environment of the day. People like Lorenzo the Magnificent, who is a Medici, he becomes a statesman, so he's a politician, and he kind of just becomes like the ruler of the city-state of Florence during the Renaissance. So like Italy itself has this kind of person in charge, but as far as Florence goes, again, we're decentralized. So he kind of becomes this person in charge of things. So you can use your money for power for sure. Now, when it comes to the work of the Renaissance, the Brunelleschi's dome is kind of one of the iconic. We had talked about how after Rome fell, the Roman Empire, dome technology had disappeared. People could not remember how to make a dome. And then this is kind of one of this resurgences of it. Like people had figured it out. This wasn't the first attempt. People had figured it out, but not really done on this grand scale. So when Brunelleschi, this artist, an architect, designs this dome, it's just kind of like the reclaiming of the old world. Like, yes, for a time, the Renaissance was, like the world in Europe had become dark and scary and not able to do the things Rome once did, but like, haha, we're back. And so this huge cathedral is built in Florence, and El Duomo is kind of that iconic, like in your face example of how Europe is on the resurgence of things. So, sorry. Here's the printing press. It shows how the printing press kind of popped up. And that's the thing, like, you're not going to have every town having a printing press. Like, that's crazy. It's way new technology and it's expensive. But they start popping up in new places as the technology extends. And just the number of copies you have of books printed, it's super cool. I love books. So I love the idea of the printing press making reading more accessible to everyone. Because again, the example is, if you wanted a copy of the Bible, you had to pay the amount for a Bible that was handwritten. And if you've ever seen a copy of the Christian Bible, it's huge. And it would be these monks sitting in those monasteries like for hours each day, like hand transcribing these pages from the Bible and copying it down to be passed along. But then when you have the printing press, things like that, or just like non-religious works, or even public decrees or whatever, cartoons, they can be printed on these things, and they spread ideas everywhere very quickly. So one of the things that is printed on the printing press down the road is the book The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. He is an Italian political theorist, and this book, The Prince, it's a practical guide for ruling based on power, politics, warfare, and popular goodwill. And it's this whole idea that he basically made a prince in Italy really mad and was chased out. And as like an apology, he wrote this kind of book like, here, Prince, you're doing a great job. And I just thought I'd build you up by how great you're doing, and also give you this book of like, here's how to be a great prince, which you're already doing. But it's the popular question of, for leaders, what is the better type of leader to be? One that is loved or one that is feared? And so in this book, he enters in this section for like a great debate of which one is better and why and how it makes a difference. So it's him giving advice to royalty on how to be not even like the nicest leader, but like how to maintain control. We have Dante's The Divine Comedy. So if you've heard of Dante's Inferno, that's probably the most popular. It's this imaginary tale of this guy going through purgatory in one session. The other book is him going through all the layers of hell. And then also there's one where he goes through paradise or like heaven. And he talks to a bunch of people he sees there, and you figure out what sins you commit to go in which version of hell. And it really creates modern day ideas of what hell looks like, right? And all the specific horrible punishments that would happen to people there. Except oddly enough, when you get to the deepest pits of hell in Dante's Inferno, we usually come up with like fire, right? But in his version, it's like ice. Everything is ice. So like the people, I think it's like 3 people who committed the worst atrocities and the worst sins. They were actually frozen in ice and unable to do anything except feel pain or something like very dark. But he really is the one, I guess, to blame for a lot of our stereotypical views on like what hell looks like and what it is. Okay. We can't watch these. Again, not pausing. I will attach these, but yeah, I'll just attach this PowerPoint. If you want to go through and watch these, you can. So this is a video about, did the church actually hate Copernicus? Because I had always heard like that they had put him on trial and they had disagreed with his theories about like the elliptical planets. And no, they didn't. They actually were totally fine with his work. It's just like kind of this myth that's evolved. But we did talk about Copernicus and how he had borrowed works from somebody in Dar al-Islam. And it's just been overshadowed. So I think this video talks about that a little bit too. So his whole deal was, I think he's the one that talks about like elliptical movements of planets, how they don't move in a perfect circle. It's actually more like an oval shape based on his observations from the globe. You can talk about Leonardo da Vinci. He is a great example of a man working in the Renaissance. They actually call him a quote Renaissance man, which is just somebody who's good at everything. So you have like his anatomical drawings, which are all just beautifully done. And people are like, how did he know? Well, him and people like even Michelangelo and modern, like people studying medicine at the time, they dig up corpses. It was a huge business where you would want to go and get fresh bodies so you could pick them apart in your home. And that's how we got all these drawings. Like it sounds grotesque, but also they're like, how else would we learn, you know? And for a while they had these cages that they put on top of people's graves. And the only reason these like iron gated blocked things were shoved into the ground over a newly dug grave was because of grave robbers, like people providing bodies for Da Vinci, because it was a big business for things like that. So they would keep these cages over until the body had decomposed enough where no one would ever want to use it for medical purposes, because it'd be past the point of like decomposition. This middle one is a self-portrait we have of Da Vinci. And then we have Mona Lisa, who is always his iconic work, which I'm going to tell you right now. I never thought like it was an amazing painting. But when I did get to go to Paris to the Louvre and went into the room where the Mona Lisa is, it is just so much smaller than you'd think. And the room is so crowded. You know, there were plenty of other paintings. Da Vinci has other ones that I saw up close that were, I think, much more beautiful. But she is one that just like the rumor is that he carried around this painting for his whole life. It was the wife of a rich person who had asked this portrait to be done. And I guess artistically, like art history speaking, it's interesting because that whole background behind her is completely made up. If you were trying to find a landscape where that would actually exist, it's impossible to have a look like that because they don't align. But when you look at it, you don't naturally think like something's off. So it's cool. He didn't paint something he actually saw. He painted her and then he just like made up this beautiful background in the back. So he also was an inventor. The idea of making like a tank or like a helicopter way before his time, or before the time of these things. So again, his notebooks are just full of cool stuff. The effects of the Renaissance, it created support for a government kind of based in the city. And also it just brought science into the mainstream. It was this idea of going away from the old Dark Ages way of thinking into a more modern way, which would match up with what was going on in the rest of the world, like in Baghdad. Literacy expanded, people had intellectual debates, and all of this will eventually lead to something called the Reformation, which splits the church and kind of blows everything up and changes Europe. But it also leads to the Enlightenment, which are going to lead to major political revolutions throughout the globe. And the rest of this PowerPoint is just famous art from the Renaissance. I love art history. I'm really sad we're not going to be able to go over this in class because it is super fun. So I'm going to do super crash course. Again, if you don't want to listen to this, you don't want to look at Renaissance art, I would say look at a couple because they are iconic and kind of show you what people are doing back in the day and how art has changed. But otherwise, it's just kind of like a fun antidote, a fun note about things. So some of the work is by people like Sandro Botticelli. And this painting is not religious. Like, I think that's a huge change. We looked at Ugly Medieval Babies, and it was pretty much about Jesus, Mary, Christianity, something from the Bible. Here we have a depiction from like Greco-Roman times, right? This goddess Venus and the story of her birth, that she floated on a shell across the water and landed on the mainland. You have the wind being blown by what kind of looks like this angel creature over here. And also we can talk about the different assumptions of what beauty and stuff kind of was iconically represented as. So Renaissance art, she's super long and kind of awkward looking because her arms are forever long, but she's super pale. She's got a little bit of a belly on her, and she has this beautiful strawberry blonde red hair. And again, so does this woman over here. And it's this idea that I love Renaissance art or any kind of art throughout the ages because it shows you what was seen as like the epitome of beauty for the most part. So this idea that like red hair, pale skin, not being rail thin, these were things that were iconically beautiful in the day because it meant status in life. This is Michelangelo's sculpture. If we were in class, I would obsess with this in front of you for like 5 to 10 minutes because it's so wonderful. The fact that this is one piece of marble, it was a huge boulder, and he carved this out of it. And it is a depiction of Jesus after he was pulled off of the cross, laying on his mother's lap after he is dead. Just the fact that this is stone, but you can see the folds of her dress. It's just beautiful. Even where her fingers are on him here, there's like obviously a cloth, but if you look further, like right there where my mouse is, you can see that he's shown like it's indented, like it's pushing into his flesh, or even his arm here. Like if you've ever picked up a baby, you know, their skin like smushes, and so does his. Like it's just hyper realistic almost. It's beautiful. And also the fact that it takes you a moment to realize like that's a fully grown man in the lap of a woman. So it wouldn't look like this. He almost looks like a child, right? But at first it's not so weird that you're like, oh, what's wrong with it? It's just beautiful. And the story is that after he had carved it, he was letting people from the church that had wanted it, like bring people in to view it, and he hid behind a pillar. And people were like, there's no way a human could have made this. This was clearly only crafted by the hand of God because it's too beautiful. No human on this earth could have ever created something. So Michelangelo was super salty about it. And so across her chest here, there's a little banner and it has his name. It's the only work he did that he ever signed. Because again, he was super irritated that people were like, no person could do that. And he's like, I can. So it's in the Vatican today. It's kept away from the crowds and behind bulletproof glass because I think it was like in the 80s or something. Somebody brought a gun in and tried to shoot it. So it's heavily protected now, but it's still beautiful. You had people, this one does have, Albert Dürer did this one, and it's the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, another thing from religion, right? And you have these creepy dudes, the 4 Horsemen, bringing in the apocalypse and the end of time. And this is an etching. So he would have carved it on like wood and then stamped this in. So it's crazy detail to think that he carved the reverse image. So wherever you see white is the part he had carved away on a block of wood, and he left the little gray black strips because that's where the ink would have gone on the stamp. Leonardo's Last Supper, most of it is not his work anymore. It's painted over his original work because he made the base of the paint with egg yolks, and it, it decomposed over time. So people have gone in to like kind of fix it up over the years. It's still his original design where the things were, but a lot of it is not like the paint put there by his hand. On the wall of a monastery that was damaged during World War II. So we're lucky it survived. It almost didn't. The David is by Michelangelo again, and this thing is like, it's like 9 feet tall or something, and then it's put on a huge base. And it is a story of David and Goliath. So David is like a young teenage boy who fights a giant, and he wins because he has a slingshot and he hits the giant Goliath in the forehead with it and he kills him. And the only reason this happened is, like David is a Jew who, or he's an Israelite at the time, so they call him, but he has like God on his side, so that's why he's able to do it. This statue is beautiful, but again, disproportionate. Like his hand is huge. And but initially when you look at it, you might not be drawn to it as like it's awkward. He drew the hand so big because this is the hand where the rock is, and in this hand, that's the slingshot he has draped down his back. But if you look at it, this whole thing is carved in 360. If you look at the top of his head, there's little pin curls. All of this is super detailed. And then his eyes are really deep burrows to make you look like he's looking deeply at something, because he's supposed to be staring at Goliath. So it's a whole story. It's beautiful. Again, it was attacked, so it's kept kind of with a border around it, like a shield around it, because somebody hit off some of his toes with a hammer one time. Here's the Mona Lisa again. Most people were like, notice her because she doesn't have any eyebrows. We think they probably just drifted away over the years because of wear and tear, that they were probably there. They were just probably light. Some women would say like, or some people say that women at a time didn't have eyebrows, like they'd shave them off to avoid like lice and stuff. But we think she probably had them. They're just kind of gone now. Sistine Chapel, it's a whole ceiling of a chapel at the Vatican in Rome, and it tells different stories. Each panel here is a different story from the Old Testament. And then you have a bunch of prophets and stuff off to the sides. So example, God separating light from dark. It's the story of the creation of the universe per se from the first book of the Bible. And then you have creation of the sun and the moon. And this was a super scandalous one that everyone was kind of offended by. Why? Because that's God's butt. You can see it clinging a little too tight with his robe. So you can see God's butt cheeks, and everyone was kind of offended and didn't know if they wanted to let this fly. And the more famous is the creation of Adam. And it's this idea that, God is touching the finger of Adam, who he's created, and it's giving him a life. But then you have all these people over here. And this supposedly is supposed to be Eve, who God is like keeping under his arm, because the story is he creates Adam. Adam gets lonely. He takes out one of Adam's ribs and creates Eve. So Adam has a partner in the world. Cool thing is, I like it as a psychology teacher formerly. It kind of looks like it's the shape of a brain. So people wondered, because we know Michelangelo was super into like human anatomy, that we're wondering if it's like him saying, yeah, he's given him life, but maybe life is like consciousness and the ability to think. I don't know. I think it's a cool concept. So all of these are beautifully done on the ceiling of this church. And then you also have the Last Judgment, where you have Jesus, who doesn't look like your iconic Christian Jesus that most people know in the Western world. He's got like, 32 abs, and he looks pretty angry and mean. And even his mom, Mary, is like shunning against him, like not wanting to look at him. Mary, that like, I always think this sticks out, this blue circle. It sticks out because it wasn't supposed to be there. She had bare legs, and people thought that was very inappropriate for the Virgin Mary to have bare legs. So long after Michelangelo, they went in and they had somebody paint over his work to shield her legs. There is supposedly, do I have it? No. There is supposedly a depiction of Michelangelo's self-portrait here. So this is Saint Bartholomew, and in his story, Bartholomew is flayed, so his skin is peeled from his body, so he's holding that. And if you zoom in on this, it supposedly kind of looks like Michelangelo's face. The other thing is, can't see him in here. Oh, where is he? He's over here somewhere. There's a guy getting pulled down by a snake, like screaming with his head turned up. And it was this guy that Michelangelo really, really hated. So he forever put him in this painting being dragged down into the pits of hell. I mean, again, that's one way to permanently get back at your enemies, I suppose. You guys will be watching Heimler. I'm not going to watch it with you, but you guys are watching this to kind of give you a better rundown more specifically. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful. Hopefully it helps you fill out the stuff in your interactive notebook. All right. Well, I will see you on Tuesday. All right. Bye.